Thank you all very much for coming. This is another event in our GDI lecture series. And today we have the pleasure to host Professor David Ludwig from the University of Wageningen. And David is a transdisciplinary researcher and a philosopher whose work focuses on questions of social and environmental change. And he is interested in topics such as methods for transdisciplinarity and transformation, global epistemologies and ontologies, and broadly understood politics of knowledge, which I think is something that he's going to touch upon also today. So he published widely in journals that are both kind of philosophy-specific, but also social science, anthropology, communication, responsible innovation. So he has a very kind of broad range of interests. And we actually met when I was still working at Wageningen University in the Netherlands in a group called Knowledge, Technology, Innovation, which is a very transdisciplinary group where we had plant scientists, but also social scientists, and a philosopher among us. So I think this created a very unique sort of environment, and it also takes a special skill to thrive as an academic in such a very varied environment. And David recently completed two kind of large projects, an ERC-funded one and a Dutch university sort of government-funded one that were both focused on ontologies and epistemologies of knowledge, but they were also empirically driven, which I think is something quite rare for a philosopher. So I'm really excited to hear more about his work today. And the talk is going to take a little under an hour, so there will be ample space for questions. We leave the questions for him, is that correct?
Well, I mean, if they're burning questions, feel free to raise your hand. Okay. It's not that I can't be interrupted, so
great.
It's fine.
Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me move the others around. Okay, well, thank you everyone for showing up. Nice to have so many people being interested in epistemology. I did not expect that. So the title, Epistemology of International Development, as Katarzyna said, I'm originally a philosopher. I was trained in philosophy of science and sociology of science. I'm kind of studying what scientists do and how scientists produce knowledge. And I've been, in my PhD, interested in how scientific knowledge relates to other forms of knowledge that people outside of academia produce. And then for the past 8 years or so, I kind of started working with people in international development, with international development organizations and development scholars without ever having been trained in that field. Because for me, as someone who's interested in epistemologies, or the study of knowledge, international development is fascinating, right? Because it's fascinating what type of knowledge counts in this field, what type of knowledge becomes excluded, and how knowledge was kind of translated in Dutch. And so that's been kind of the concern of me for the past kind of 8 or 9 years, where I kind of made that move from being just a philosopher of science towards a transdisciplinary scholar working also in a department that involves a lot of international development and especially a lot of applied development projects. And so in the course of that journey, we developed a project on transformative transdisciplinarity. What you can see here is kind of the title of our forthcoming book. So that's been a long journey, and the book is coming out early next year with Oxford University Press, and it's going to be open access. If you're interested in the stuff that I'm talking about, feel free to send me an email, and I should just send you the manuscript. It's ready. And so, as you can see with the subtitle, An Introduction to Community-Based Philosophy, our project is still very much about philosophy. It's about trying to understand for different forms of knowledge, different values, different worldviews, relate to each other, and kind of for us to try to think about it as philosophers clearly, While at the same time, it's also a book about the kind of action research that we've been developing over the past 8 years. And all of this started in a small village called Seribinha in Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil, in the state of Bahia, where my co-author, Charles, was also a professor. And then 3 or 4 years ago, I also started collaborating with colleagues from the Center of Indigenous Knowledge and Organizational Development at Ghana. And so there we've been working in the farming instead of the fishing community called Foripron, which is in the transition zone of Ghana, somewhere in the middle near the bigger city of Tachinla. And so what we're trying to do is, on the one hand, look how development initiatives and negotiations between scientists and communities kind of play out and think about that critically philosophically, while at the same time also then trying to kind of use our critical reflection as philosophers to do something useful and kind of mediating between different forms of knowledge. Now, I can't talk about all of the stuff that's happening in the book, but what I want to talk about is basically what happens in the first chapter of the book, where we talk about 3 different modes of thinking about knowledge practices, especially in development contexts, that we name epistemic paternalism, epistemic diversity, and epistemic decolonization. And so that little figure that you see there, we'll get back to that, and just for you to get a little primer of that, our idea is not to kind of just tell a linear story of kind of how development moves from paternalistic to diversity to decolonizing mode, but that there is a lot of complex negotiation going on between these different ways of negotiating what knowledge is, whose knowledge counts, whose knowledge doesn't count when people kind of do development interventions. Now, epistemic paternalism as kind of the starting mode is, I think, something that anyone who's kind of working with a critical perspective in development studies is quite familiar with, right? Because it's very deeply rooted in how international development became institutionalized in kind of the early kind of Cold War period, where, of course, before we had international development as an institutional practice, a lot of that was, of course, grounded in colonial relations that have a very clear epistemic structure as well, right? Colonialism was always based on the systematic denial of the knowledge of the colonized, right? That's how the kind of civilizing mission of colonialism could be sold, right? It was because it was supposed to be the colonizers who had all the knowledge, and the ones who were colonized who didn't have the knowledge, that they needed to be educated, right? And whether that's by scientists or by missionaries or by whoever else came there, right? And then with the process of political decolonization, as you all know, colonists quite quickly transformed into development workers, often in the 50s and the 60s, right? As kind of one hat off, other hat on. And for me, as someone who is kind of trying to think about epistemology, about knowledge issues, it's quite interesting how a lot of the political and economic narratives changed in that process, so a kind of early Cold War period of decolonization. Well, the epistemic narratives didn't change at all, right? And so just to give you like one example of that, Truman's famous speech that's been often kind of marked as in the birth hour of modern development regime, saying that the old imperialism, exploitation for foreign profit, has no place in our plans. But he also says, then the benefit of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and the growth of the underdeveloped areas will be the focus. So on the one hand, there's a clear attempt to kind of create distance between the new development regime and old colonialism in economic terms, right? It's not exploitation for foreign profit ends. No. At the same time, if you think in this for side for knowledge, right? It's of course still the American or European scientists who are then gracefully sharing all their knowledge with underdeveloped world, right? So the hierarchies on the epistemic side remain the same, even if the kind of political and economic narratives shift. And of course, that's not like a new the discovery that I'm making. Has been pointed out by a lot of scholars, a lot of kind of also the deep colonial literature, right? If they think of kind of concepts like neocolonialism, like Krummer's form of thinking about that, for example, is one that is crucially like the stomach you are, right? The idea that even if, in that case, Ghana has become an independent nation and it's politically decolonized, neocolonialism still remains both of course, as a form of economic dependence, but also as a form of epistemic, right? As a kind of structure of assuming that it is only the knowledge of the Western trained scientists who can bring Africa off poverty. Right? So you all know these times of very paternalistic narratives. And so for me, as someone, as I said, who's been trained as a philosopher of science, I'm especially interested in how scientists engage in development projects. I, for example, visited this organization, some of you may know, CIMIT, in Texcoco, just in Mexico, just north of Mexico City. Can just kind of translate what you can see here on the slide. So CIMIT is an organization dedicated to the improvement mainly of the production and the quality of maize and wheat in the world, in collaboration with national institutions, men of science, agriculturalists, leaders in government and industry. Its programs are financed by a consortium of international agencies with interest in resolving the problem of hunger. So CIMIT is an organization that clearly has, I think, very sincere humanitarian ambitions as a development organization, as a research for development organizations. Like, you see that big poster there that I took a photo of when I arrived, of like maize and wheat science for improved livelihoods. And it does have, and I think it's an organization that has done quite a bit of good, right? If you think of, for example, life expectancy around the world in the past 50 years and how it has changed, of course, that is related to improved agricultural practices that have been partly driven by organizations like CIMIT. But at the same time, it is by design a very, very paternalistic institution, where the narrative of that institution is, it is, as you can have it here in the stature, the man of science, right? Who are producing the knowledge and who are bringing the underdeveloped nations out of hunger, right? And one of the reasons why I went to CIMIT was because I was interested in that particular man of science called Norman Borlaug. Norman Borlaug is the only natural scientist, as far as I know, who has ever received a Nobel Peace Prize rather than a kind of scientific Nobel Prize for his work. And the story of that is that he has been widely framed as the so-called father of the Green Revolution, where the Green Revolution, as you see here, there's four of there's eight, but that been up in the 60s, was the idea of improving agricultural practices around the world through new seed systems, new forms of mechanizations, and fertilizers, and pesticides, and commodity chains, and so on and so on, that will greatly increase the availability for food around the world. And then the Nobel Prize was awarded to Bowler because, as a Nobel committee said, he literally saved the lives of hundreds of millions of people who would otherwise have starved. So that's kind of the humanitarian paternalistic story. Science advances, comes up with all kinds of great new discoveries that, for example, brings people out of hunger, right? And so we need to transport that knowledge from, for example, those scientists to, in this case, in Summit, it was first Mexico, and then, of course, his new maize and wheat varieties were kind of exported in the other rest of the world, whether that was India or Africa, wherever. Now, the Green Revolution is an interesting case study for thinking about epistemology and epistemic paternalism because it has become so contested. Right? So there is the Nobel Prize winning narrative, right? But there's also the counter-narrative, and I think many of you will, for example, have at least come across Shiver's book of The Violence of the Green Revolution. There's been also a very strong anti-Green Revolution and anti-modernization movement in Mexico. One of the big proponents of that had been Gustavo Esteve, who, for example, writes here, in Mexico, you must be either very dumb or very rich if you fail to notice that development stakes. The damage to persons, the corruption of politics, the degradation of nature, which until recently were only implicit in development, can now be seen, touched, and smelt. And so I think for most of you who are studying or even researchers in international developments, we're kind of familiar with these types of contestations, right? Like on the one hand, the kind of the story that through modern science, through modernization, through progress, through new technologies, we're kind of elevating people out of hunger or poverty, of whatever problems they may have, and often that's a very paternalistic kind of one-directional process of knowledge transfer from the West to the rest, right? And then you have a kind of counter-narrative, so people challenging that and saying that is not only kind of the one way of thinking about knowledge, but ultimately it does harm to the people, right? And so that's kind of the intellectual context in which we've worked with those two communities that I mentioned at the beginning and that I kind of want to get back to several times over the course of the lecture. On the one hand, Ceibinha in Brazil, where Brazil is a country that has for a long time, from across all political spectrums, very much embraced that narrative of modernization, right? Like for example, Brazil as one of the biggest agro producers in the world, right? And then us working with primarily disenfranchised rural communities in Bahia, which is one of the poorest regions in Brazil, often the official narrative is that they will be the beneficiaries of these types of development. And then us having spent a lot of time with them over the 8 or 9 years is kind of realizing that often they're of course not the ones who are benefiting, right? Because a lot of kind of the top-down projects that are imposed on these communities actually arrive as forms of violence into these communities. Often, for example, there are issues with gentrification in the sense that it's a very beautiful area and they try to stimulate the economy through tourism, right? And then that tourism kind of rolls over these coastal communities and completely dismantles the community structures. So for some of the villages that are a bit further to the main capital of Salvador, they just become tourist resort towns, right? And so the entire community has disappeared. Their way of living or fishing has disappeared. They are now mostly working as waiters or taxi drivers or whatever for the big hotel complexes that are externally owned. So the promise of just kind of externally stimulating development in these communities and that will benefit them has clearly not played out in the favor of the people in Ceibinha. And similar issues have occurred in foreground, where again there has been a lot of push of kind of science-driven modernization of agriculture. Those are kind of indigenous farming communities who are clearly not productive enough in the way how they grow yam or cocoyam or whatever. So they're supposed to kind of adopt new varieties, kind of produce more for the market, right? But then often what happens in these kind of expert-driven innovation programs is that they eradicate local community structures. Because in the end, they can only lose if they're trying to compete for the cheapest commodities on the global market, right? And so a lot of the people adopt the new varieties of what they're supposed to grow. They're still not making enough money. They're not only losing their traditional practices, but they also then, often their kids don't see a future in the villages anymore. They move to the city, and so on. So that's, I think, a quite familiar process. Which brings me to the second part of what I wanted to talk about here, which is kind of the turn from epistemic paternalism to epistemic diversity as a mode of doing international development. Now, I think the overall narrative, I hope, is also something that you've often encountered already. Right? So what I've talked about so far is the, I think, well-established observation that the external imposition of science-based solution often miss local realities, right? And they miss local needs. And they often reinforce a very harmful vision of modernization that's not actually in the interest of the communities that are supposedly benefiting from that kind of modernization projects. So how do you do better? Right? And so one of the ways of trying to do better is to say, well, we need to diversify the type of knowledge that we're relying on when we're doing development. Right? So we're not only listening to the plant breeders from Summit, who are kind of coming up with more productive varieties of maize and wheat, right? But we're also listening to the community elders, to the extension workers, to the farmers, the fishers, the medical practitioners, the policymakers, the science communicators, the social activists, the teachers, the union workers, all the other people who have relevant knowledge, but whose knowledge will be excluded if you only rely on the scientists to tell you what to do. And that, at the core, is what transdisciplinarity is about. I don't know, how many here feel comfortable with the notion of transdisciplinarities? Like, does everyone feel like, oh yeah, I know what that is? Or you can be, yeah, that's kind of a term that I'm still confused by? Because in a way, it is a confusing term. So I think everyone should be confused by it, right? But the way we're using it is, I think, a pretty simple one. So interdisciplinarity typically means bringing scientists from different fields together, right? So a lot of, global challenges, climate change, biodiversity laws, public health, urban poverty, whatever, they're complex issues, right? And you can't just rely on one scientific discipline to address it, right? So you often need to bring together, for example, economists and anthropologists with ecologists and engineers or whatever, right? And those are interdisciplinary projects. And I think that's quite well established, like all universities want to be interdisciplinary these days and so on and so on. Transdisciplinarity, at least the way how I use the term, just means we're not only bringing people from different academic disciplines together, but we're also bringing academics and non-academics, right? So we're trying to further diversify the knowledge by not just saying, oh, we need the knowledge of the natural scientist and the social scientist, but we also need the knowledge of the farmer, the union worker, the policymaker, and so on, right? So that's the idea of transdisciplinary. And why the transdisciplinary? Well, I think there are kind of two promises that typically are made with this type of transdisciplinary work that are, of course, connected, but, philosophers love to make distinctions. So I'm kind of still trying to pull them apart for at least for a little bit. One is kind of more the epistemic promise that, a lot of different people know different dates. And if you want like a well-working development intervention, right, you better listen to everyone as well with knowledge. Right? So for example, in Wageningen, we work a lot on conserving the local mangrove forests. Yeah, of course, the ecologist will have a lot of knowledge in how to preserve the mangroves. But the fishers who are fishing in the mangroves for every year for 40, 50 years, they have a lot of knowledge on that too. Right? So you're going to come up with a more efficient conservation plan for the mangroves if you do it in a transdisciplinary way. If you don't just listen to the ecologist, but you also listen to the fisher and kind of come up with some design that allows those two people to work together and understand each other. Right? So that's kind of epistemic promise. And the other promise is much more straightforwardly political, right? It's not just about coming up with more efficient or robust or effective or reliable interventions. It's also about coming up with more equal and just interventions, right? The idea that if you do things in a transdisciplinary way and you include the knowledge of people who are not part of the arrangement, you also have a chance to include the knowledge and the values and the concerns of the people who are typically excluded from academic knowledge. Right? And so that's, of course, with kind of the examples that I gave you earlier, I think relatively straightforward. If in many of these kind of failed projects of kind of green revolution modernization, if people would have just listened to the farmers, right, a lot of the damage could have been avoided. Because often, of course, a lot of the stuff that is externally imposed and that is often resisted by local communities when it comes to kind of modernization projects is framed in the paternalistic modes of, those kind of, backwards farmers, they don't want to adopt our beautiful, shiny innovations, right? Well, often, of course, the reality is that people have concerns for good reasons, right? They may know that it's not going to work in that community, right? And so if you're able to kind of bring those concerns into the process, then you'll be able to maybe not only come up with a more effective and robust intervention, but also with a kind of a more equal and just. So that's the kind of basic promise, I think, of transdisciplinarity. Now, that's something that has kind of driven our projects, the Global Epistemologies and Ontologies, or GEOS project in Wageningen that I've been coordinating for the past 8 years, where we've been trying to build very diverse communities of practice, bringing together scientists and kind of non-scientific, non-academic experts, whether they're fishers or farmers or community builders or wherever, in trying to come up with solutions together. And so those are kind of three of the teams of our project. On the top row, that's the Brazil team, and the bottom left, that's the Ghana team, and in the bottom right, that's the Mexico team. Now, I don't really have time to walk you through all these different geographic contexts. I'm actually wondering whether I should walk you through any of them. But maybe to just briefly go over this with one example. So in Wageningen and the neighboring village of Poços, as I said, it's located here in Brazil, in the state of Bahia, and on this kind of peninsula where there is a mangrove forest and an Atlantic Ocean on this side. We've been trying to find ways of bringing then the local knowledge of the community and the scientific knowledge together and co-creating better interventions. Right? And so that has involved, for example, a lot of studies of local expertise, trying to first of all document how people in the communities are experts about ecology. Yeah? So showing that it's not just ecology professors who come there, who of course matter, right? And who has a lot of knowledge that people in the community don't have. But a lot of the people in the community has very fine-grained ecological knowledge that the ecology professor didn't have because he hasn't fished in the mangroves for the past 50 years. And so those are examples, you can read up about that, about kind of ecological phenomena in those communities that the fishers were able to explain, but the scientists weren't, simply for the reason that the fishers have had that much more time to kind of try to understand the causal relations in this kind of complex ecological system. And then moving beyond these types of kind of just documenting the expertise of the people in the communities, we then try to see how can we translate that expertise into better and more just policies. And so this is, I think, a relatively straightforward example. There's a period in Brazil called the defisal, which is a period where the fishers are not allowed to fish. And so the basic idea is, you don't allow the fishers to fish certain months of the years when the fish lay their eggs, so you don't disturb the reproductive cycle, right? And then once the eggs are laid, you can start fishing again. And so what you see on the right side here is from our studies that the red period is when the Brazilian law says the fishers in Sardinia are not allowed to fish. And then the bars are when the fishers tell us they actually find fish with eggs, right? And you can see it's a complete mismatch. For example, here, when it comes to the shrimp, the periods where they're not allowed to fish the shrimp are not at all the months where the fishers know the shrimp laid eggs. Right? So if you would be able to design fishing policies in this case that would incorporate the local expertise of the fishers, right, rather than just externally top-down set by the government in Brasilia or like the state government in Salvador, you would be able to come up with fishing policies that actually protect the species in a better way and would allow the fishers to actually also make a better income. Another thing that we've been doing is more about intercultural education, projects of trying to bring together those different forms of knowledge in the local school education, right? Those villages have one school, and typically the biology school books, they're just exported from the big city to the village, and they're completely disconnected from the local realities of the kids. And they certainly don't teach anything about the local knowledge in this group, right? And so we came together with the teachers and try to develop new school materials that both highlight the knowledge that the community has as well as kind of relevant scientific knowledge that the kids need to learn. And so we can bring them together, for example, in a way that pressures by climate change can be in meaningful ways connected to the reality of the kids in the villages. Great. I think, I hope that was not too quick, and it gives you a good sense of the motivation of kind of the move towards transdisciplinarity and how that promises to kind of move development projects away from like a paternalistic mode where it's just kind of the externally trained expert who goes to your communities and tells people what to do, towards a more kind of co-productive mode where you take different forms of knowledge seriously and you find ways of kind of working together in a better way. Right? Now, I think the story that I've told so far has been told, of course, in many ways, already by other people, but often the story ends it, right? Then it's like, okay, we kind of move from epistemic, kind of top-down, paternalistic modes towards kind of co-creation, transdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, participatory, citizen science, whatever kind of modes of like education. Okay, it's like a whole cloud of buzzwords around this kind of move towards epistemic diversity. And I think one of the things we've learned in running these projects is it's much more complicated, right? And so one of the things we've become more and more concerned about is what we're calling now in the project the one happy family fallacy, right? So the idea of, we're including everyone, we treat everyone equal, we're creating a better world together, everyone from the fisher to the scientist to the policymaker to the company to the union worker is welcome, and everyone kind of pulls together. I mean, as you know, that's typically not the reality we're working in, right? And it is often also a very misleading narrative to tell, right? Because it is a narrative that often, for example, at universities, it sells very well, right? Like for example, Wageningen, we have the Diversity Week, and then they asked us to present our project because, we had indigenous communities and people come all over the world and they're coming together, creating a better world together. Right? But a lot of those kind of stories, they kind of gloss over the contradictions that actually kind of emerge in this type of collaboration, right? And just because, we have like a fancy diversity week in our university where we kind of present the work in Slovenia, does not mean that anything good is done for the fishers in Slovenia. They don't benefit from like some kind of glossy presentation at the university where it can show how inclusive it is, right? So how do we kind of move beyond these types of superficial appeals to diversity towards kind of ways of bringing people together that actually benefit the communities? And so that has, I think, in the past like especially 3-4 years, really kind of shaped the way how we're running this project. Where in the beginning it was more, let's challenge the paternalistic kind of structure of how all of this is, like how, for example, Brazilian conservation management is done, or how agricultural development in Ghana is done, and we move towards kind of a more diverse co-production, or towards thinking about how difficult it is to actually do co-production in an equal way. And so this is, for example, our Brazilian team, like our last meeting that we had in Salvador earlier this year. Where, of course, in some ways, we're all smiling. We are that one happy family to some degree, but we've also struggled for 8 years together, right? And we have having a lot of very kind of frank conversation about how we're failing in this kind of setup of Kipa. And so one of the things we've learned in that has come through actually a master research project of Esther, who is the first author in this paper, who's now a PhD in our project. And so back in 2019, I think she came to me and like, on the master project I've heard about, which something to do with Brazil, I've let them out myself, I want to go there. And I was like, okay, why don't you study the way how our interaction with the communities go? Yeah? Like where are we doing well and where are we failing, right? And so that became her master research project, which is it's also her PhD project now. And so what she found is that, well, we all have good intentions, right? But often good intentions alone are, of course, not sufficient. And so she identified like this kind of complex network of challenges that the project encountered when actually trying to kind of co-produce together in a more equal way. Some of it are pretty straightforward, just kind of the power differentials and transdisciplinary teams, right? So Brazil, it's a very classist, very racist country. The communities we work with are largely disenfranchised black communities. Within academia, in contrast, is largely white middle class, right? Then you have the kind of European, how it is at the Wageningen team that kind of, again, fits different part of friendship with the Brazilian researchers, and how do we navigate our. So those are, I think, the pretty straightforward things that we were aware of, right? But there were other things that I think we weren't fully aware of when running this project. And so one of the areas where I think we often failed in this was really connecting critical theory to facts. So as you can hear, I'm a philosopher, so I read, all these kind of critical theory texts, right? Like the feminist philosophy, the colonial theory, and so on and so on. So they come, to the village with all these kind of critical theory texts. So what now, right? How do you translate all that kind of critical dating or, the colonial, feminist, whatever ambitions into actual egalitarian practice when working together in a community? It's very, very difficult. A lot of, the PhD were very old had such. And so that was another area where I think we often failed, especially in that related to the third domain, in order to bridge that gap of, just kind of thinking or talking critically, to actually doing something together with disenfranchised people in a way that benefits them. You need a lot of interpersonal skills of building trust, listening to each other, establishing character with and that's not something you're typically trained for as a PhD, right? It's also something that's very, very difficult to do unless you have enough time to actually, kind of get to know each other. And so it has to be done. Which kind of led to the fourth part, or the institutional pressures. For a lot of the people in our team who are there, they didn't have the time to actually develop those skills, right? Because in order to develop those skills and to for example, span enough time in the community, we already, for example, had enough resources to do that. And so we're running that project in Brazil under the Bolsonaro years, and everyone was kind of running out of money. Everyone was stressed. Often, the students came there and had like 2 months time of collecting their data, right? How do you build a trusting relationship in 2 months, right? And then there was all the kind of competitiveness of trying to, get your thesis done, having to collect your data to publish a paper, How do you weigh that against doing community-based work that's actually meaningful for the communities? Right? And for a lot of the students in the team, that became a really difficult thing to navigate, right? Because they don't have like the resources or the time to spend years there. So they need to kind of get going and collect their data, while at the same time they want to do things in a transdisciplinary way that actually benefits the community. Very, very difficult to navigate. Right? So the reality then of moving, of kind of bringing different knowledges together, working transdisciplinarily, often encounters institutionally a very difficult reality, where it's, I don't think, very surprising that transdisciplinary projects typically have great stories and a lot of failures that are not being talked about. And so, looking critically at these types of stories of co-production, transdisciplinarity, and knowledge integration, and citizen science, and participation, and multi-stakeholder platforms, and so on and so on. Of course, it also kind of became clear for us that we're not the only ones who have concerns about that, right? And one of the I think the broader concerns in the field is that a lot of knowledge integration, especially between scientific and indigenous knowledge, ends up being very extractive, right? So it is recognizing the knowledge of people who are non-academic stakeholders, but using it for academic purposes. Huh? So, for example, a conservation biologist may be like, okay, let's work with indigenous knowledge. Let's not be paternalistic anymore. And let's recognize that the indigenous community knows a lot about how to conserve the forest, right? But then they kind of test that knowledge and build that into their own conservation funds, right? So it just becomes additional data for the consumption of academics. It's not something that necessarily benefits the communities. It can actually very easily backfire, and I can tell quite a few stories of that, right? There's, for example, communities would share their knowledge about wacky species with conservation biologists, and they use that to come after new conservation plans that kind of, for example, criminalize the traditional hunting of the community. Right? So just because we bring different knowledges together doesn't mean that the communities actually benefit. And so that's a lot those types of concerns have been widely articulated across decolonial scholarship, where a lot of people are highlighting that diversity is not the same as decolonization. Right? Decolonization is challenging the effects of colonialism. And just because you bring different knowledges together doesn't mean that you're challenging, right? A lot of these transdisciplinary projects, they're actually bringing more diverse knowledges within the existing dominant frameworks rather than challenging, right? And so then epistemic decolonization in that sense is clearly a step beyond just epistemic diversity. It's not the happy story of we bring everyone together and we create a better world together, but we're first recognizing how the existing frameworks are often stacked against certain communities and certain knowledge workers, right? And we ask what type of knowledge production would actually benefit. Great. Now, one of the things, and I'm coming almost to the end of my talk, that we've been stuck with now is like, how far do we push that argument, right? Moving from these kind of very optimistic, maybe sometimes a bit hippie stories of, let's embrace diversity and work together, towards kind of a more critical decolonial frame, has, I think, a lot of potential, at least in two directions. One, first, it allows us to see unequal realities instead of just kind of pretending that we're all equal, right? Because in international development projects and also in transdisciplinary co-production, multi-stakeholder projects, we're not equal, right? And we need to come to terms with that if we want to work better together. And it also allows us often to see the tensions and the differences instead of just the complementarity between different forms of knowledge, right? One of the problems with kind of the very simple diversity story is the idea that all the different standpoints kind of complement each other, right? And some of the standpoints are kind of built on the oppression of others, right? And so you can't just assume that they all come together in perfect harmony, because often there will be very straightforward tensions between, for example, the knowledge that's produced by an indigenous farming communities and a large agri-food company, right? And so the idea that we just kind of bring together the knowledge that's produced by Monsanto scientists and indigenous communities is not going to work, because that's not how knowledge relates to each other. So we need to talk about the tensions and the differences between different forms of knowledge. At the same time, and that's what I said, we're kind of still trying to figure out how far that type of critique should be pushed in our own transdisciplinary project. If you see the relations between, for example, scientific and indigenous knowledge only as a relation of oppression, right? Only as a relation of tension, then it becomes unclear how co-production, how dialogue, how mutual understanding could emerge in the first place. Right? So the idea of critically looking at these kind of overly optimistic diversity stories should not lead to kind of inverting that story and thinking it's only about tension, it's only about power, right? There also needs to be space for dialogue, for mutual understanding. And so that's something we've been working on in this paper, if you're interested in, called Confrontation or Dialogue, Productive Tensions Between Decolonial and Intercultural Scholarship, where we engage with those two African philosophers, Olufemi Taiwo and Mogoko Ramosa, who've both become critical of the whole kind of decolonization discourse, because they're worried that the way how it's been structured is undermining the very possibility of dialogue and the very possibility of mutual understanding in development and in other types of intercultural encounters. Okay, I've been talking for a long time. And of course, on these philosophical things, much more could be said, but I only have one more slide where I kind of want to tie it back to more the question of of development practice and what this type of philosophical reasoning can do for people who are working in development. And I think one thing that's maybe almost trivial, right, is that like development interventions, they always depend on knowledge, right? We always kind of, if you want to intervene, whether that's kind of in urban or rural settings and help or foods or whatever you're working on, right? Any type of intervention needs to rely on kind of some type of evidence, etc. knowledge, right? And what I hope my talk has kind of shown is that critically thinking about knowledge is really important for figuring out like whose knowledge to rely on and whose knowledge counts when development interventions are being designed. And the three modes that I presented, they can't give different answers for that. Like the paternalistic mode that I started with, they say, well, we need to listen to the expert, and the expert is typically represented by, for example, the scientists work in the Research for Development organization like CIMIT, or some other academic expert. Yeah? The epistemic diversity narrative says, well, of course we need to listen to the academic expert, but we also need to listen to all the other experts, right? We need to listen to everyone who has appropriate knowledge, and that can be the academic researcher, but that can also be the farmer, the fisher, the community elder, the union worker, the teacher, the medical practitioner, what else? The epistemic decolonization narrative says, well, we can't just listen to everyone, right? Because people may have or maybe we can listen, or we can't follow everyone, because people may have radically different ideas of what we should do. And a lot of these kind of knowledges are in clear tension with each other. So what we should really do is we should kind of center around the knowledge of the oppressed, and especially those people who are most clearly affected. Now, I've presented these kind of three answers not in a linear way, but at least in a slightly more kind of circular way, and that's kind of going back maybe to this figure, was because it's not like there's like a linear progress of, international development used to be paternalistic, and then we kind of embraced epistemic diversity, and now epistemic decolonization is the next step. But rather, I think these different modes that continue to be negotiated in much of development projects, including critical development projects, where transdisciplinarity is often kind of the bridge of moving from like a truly paternalistic mode of working towards kind of embracing diversity. But there's a lot of critique of simplistic diversity talk, right? Because we can't just integrate at the same and assume everyone's going to work together and all the knowledges complement each other. So that's kind of the critique of integration that leads to this kind of decolonization. At the same time, we also need to kind of be aware that it can't just be about conflicts between different forms of knowledge, that it's only about, the Western scientific knowledge is the oppressor and the indigenous knowledge is the oppressed. Because if that's the only thing that we have to say, then we can't really understand how we can work together and have productive dialogues, right? That kind of leads us back to that epistemic diversity thing. We're kind of moving, I think, in a bit in a circle, not necessarily back circle, but at least a reflexive circle in how we're thinking about knowledge in development. Great. I leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening.